Good afternoon, friends and neighbors. Welcome to Cultural Thursdays, the monthly cultural literacy program of Central Lakes College. I'm Jason Edens, and it's my privilege to coordinate the Cultural Thursday program here at CLC. And I'm very honored to introduce our presenter today. Susan Beaulieu is an Anishinaabe citizen of the Red Lake Nation, which shares a geography with Northwest Minnesota. She's an extension educator for the University of Minnesota. And today, she'll be helping us better understand the culture and values of the Anishinaabe. Susan, thank you so much for making time. We all very much appreciate it, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Jason, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Can you just give me, is it all look good? Okay, great.
It looks great, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, Beaulieu, Nagana Benesi Quain Indigenous Cause, Megazin and Dode, Mesquagame Wazaga, Iganing Nandonjaba. My name is Susan Beaulieu, and that's a traditional greeting, a way that we would greet ourselves as Anishinaabe people. We start by saying our spirit name, and then we say our clan and where we're from, and that sort of helps orientate us to understand who each other is and how we might be related or connected. So now, as Jason mentioned, I work for the University of Minnesota Extension. I'm in family development, family resiliency, and a lot of the work that I do with tribal communities is to help our communities understand the impact of historical trauma, epigenetics, adverse childhood experiences, and how that has impacted and continues to impact our communities, as well as strategies for healing and reintegrating. I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But we're going to start with a video that I know Jason mentioned that he uses with his class, and he shared this with me. It's absolutely beautiful. It's by DJ Thomas X from the Red Lake Nation, where I am also from. So I'm going to go ahead and play this.
You booked a sunny Verb ski chalet.
Sorry about
with
that.
endless views of snow-covered peaks.
Okay.
Kick back, listen and chill to what I be speaking, because what I gotta say to you right now is very intriguing. I'm talking about the ways of the Ojibwe people that seem to be leaving. Yes, of course, I'm talking about the 7 teachings. So what are the 7 teachings? Number 1, respect. Respect is something that we seem to neglect, and if you take a look at the world, it's starting to have a big effect. So maybe we should all take a look in the mirror and put ourselves in check, because the world could be a lot better place if we showed each other some more respect. Number 2, truth. Truth is something that I should be spitting in the booth. Truth is something that could be easy to take or harder than your tooth. Truth is something that people claim they have all the way through the roof, but it's also something they forget about when they get caught in a coup. Truth is something that we gotta learn to express. It's gotta come through our hearts and our chests, not so much through our brains when we stress. Number 3, wisdom. Wisdom is something you obtain when you sit down and listen. And to obtain it, some of my people went to college and some of my people went to prison. But to have wisdom is to know that you have a gift and a reason, and you maximize on it and utilize it all 4 seasons. Just know that you have a gift. Number 4, honesty. Honestly, to be honest, it ain't like reading a book or learning Ebonics. It's kind of like learning how to be true, to hold, and to keep your promise. To be honest is to speak from your heart and to leave your head. You pick apart the dark and don't speak when your vision is red. Number 5, humility. Humility is to be humble. And to be humble is to keep it together when everything's seeming to crumble. Like you in the pitch black dark in the middle of a jungle. But when adversity comes your way, you're ready to rumble. And if you get knocked down, you get up again after you tumble. Because there's been times in my life where people tried to belittle me. It was in those moments I had to express my humility. Number 6, courage. To be courageous is to do the right thing when you have every opportunity to do what's wrong. So I got to take the opportunity to say good things inside of my songs. I got to talk about what's really real and what's really going on. But to be courageous is to do the right thing. And you pick apart the darkness to see the happiness the light brings. If you do what's right, you find your own light. And number 7, love. Love. It ain't always a white wedding and flying doves, but it's something we can express to each other because we have those feelings for the ones that are above. Love is something that I'm wishing to see. Love is something that the Creator gave to us unconditionally. Love is something as simple as saying, Gizage in, which means I love you. In Ojibwe Moen. Aho. The 7 teachings.
Jason, can I just confirm that you only see the PowerPoint again? I'm not super great with technology, everyone, so I want to acknowledge that.
Yes, Susan, we can definitely see the PowerPoint. Unfortunately, we were not able to see the video, and nearly everyone was really eager to see it. So everyone had said the same message. So if there's some way that you could try again, I know everyone was really eager to see it.
Yeah, okay, let me, so you could hear it, you just couldn't see it.
If you're a woman over 40 and you want to
That's
lose
correct.
belly fat, stop doing endless workouts.
Can you see it now?
No, ma'am, I'm afraid not.
Kick back, listen and chill to what I be speaking, because what I gotta say to you right now is very intriguing. I'm talking about the ways of the Ojibwe people that seem to be leaving. Yes, of course, I'm talking about the 7 teachings. So what are the 7 teachings? Number 1, respect. Respect is something that we seem to neglect. And if you take a look at the world, it's starting to have a big effect. So maybe we should all take a look in the mirror and put ourselves in check, because the world could be a lot better. Respect. Number 2, truth. Truth is something that I should be spitting in the booth. Truth is something that could be easy to take or harder than your tooth. Truth is something that people claim they have all the way through the roof, but it's also something they forget about when they get caught in the coup. Truth is something that we gotta learn to express. It's gotta come through our hearts and our chests, not so much through our brains when we
I'm sorry about
stress.
this. I can't even find
Number
how to
3,
get back to it.
wisdom. Wisdom is something
I'm
you
so
obtain when you
sorry.
sit down and
That's
listen.
okay, Susan.
To obtain it, some of my people went to college and some of my people went to prison. But to have wisdom is to know that you have a
Okay, found that. I don't know, Jason, because it says like my sharing was paused. And then when I clicked on to try to make it to share, then I lost everything. And so
Well, if you can share your screen again and maybe resume the presentation from where you left off, that would be just great.
if I
Although now we can see your desktop, so it may actually work now if you have a
Oh.
single desktop. So before you start the PowerPoint again, perhaps we could see it now. Yep, we can see your browser now.
I'm not, it's not pulled up here though. Let me stop sharing a second and I gotta get to it. If there's one thing that stresses me out, it's technology.
It's no
I'm
problem.
not good at it.
We have a wonderful community and we're all very eager to see it. So it's
Okay.
just fine.
Let me see.
check out this Verbo.
Wait just a second. I'll share my screen again. Okay, can you see this?
Your cousins.
Yes, ma'am.
You can see it now?
Yes, yes, we can.
Kick back, listen and chill to what I be speaking, because what I gotta say to you right now is very intriguing. I'm talking about the ways of the Ojibwe people that seem to be leaving. Yes, of course, I'm talking about the 7 teachings. So what are the 7 teachings? Number 1, respect. Respect is something that we seem to neglect, and if you take a look at the world, it's starting to have a big effect. So maybe we should all take a look in the mirror and put ourselves in check, because the world could be a lot better place if we showed each other some more respect. Number 2, truth. Truth is something that I should be spitting in the booth. Truth is something that could be easy to take or harder than your tooth. Truth is something that people claim they have all the way through the roof, but it's also something they forget about when they get caught in the coup. Truth is something that we gotta learn to express. It's gotta come through our hearts and our chests, not so much through our brains when we stress. Number 3, wisdom. Wisdom is something you obtain when you sit down and listen. And to obtain it, some of my people went to college and some of my people went to prison. But to have wisdom is to know that you have a gift and a reason, and you maximize on it and utilize it all 4 seasons. Just know that you have a gift. Number 4, honesty. Honestly, to be honest, it ain't like reading a book or learning Ebonics. It's kind of like learning how to be true, to hold, and to keep your promise. To be honest is to speak from your heart and to leave your head. You pick apart the dark and don't speak when your vision is red. Number 5, humility. Humility is to be humble. And to be humble is to keep it together when everything's seeming to crumble, like you in the pitch black dark in the middle of a jungle. But when adversity comes your way, you're ready to rumble. And if you get knocked down, you get up again after you tumble. Because there's been times in my life where people tried to belittle me. It was in those moments I had to express my humility. Number 6, courage. To be courageous is to do the right thing when you have every opportunity to do what's wrong. So I got to take the opportunity to say good things inside of my songs. I got to talk about what's really real and what's really going on. But to be courageous is to do the right thing. And you pick apart the darkness to see the happiness the light brings. If you do what's right, you find your own light. And number 7, love. Love. It ain't always a white wedding and flying doves, but it's something we can express to each other because we have those feelings for the ones that are above. Love is something that I'm wishing to see. Love is something that the Creator gave to us unconditionally. Love is something as simple as saying, Gizage in, which means I love you. In Ojibwe Moen. Aho. The 7 teachings.
All right. Give me a second to get back to my PowerPoint. Okay, can you see this again now?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Thank you. Let me quit. I probably should have did this grounding before the presentation. Or before the video. I probably would have been a little less frazzled trying to figure out the technology piece of it. But I just wanted to take a moment for us to sort of ground together, because I know it's around noon and people are coming from busy stuff in the morning, and you have stuff this afternoon. And so just really taking a moment to bring ourselves into this moment together today as we start. And so I invite you to just get your body into a comfortable position. And if it helps to bring your attention inward, you can close your eyes. Otherwise, just having a soft gaze down at the floor or whatever is in front of you. Breathing in deeply and through the nose, filling the belly, imagining the belly's like a balloon. Slowly exhaling, breathing nice and easy. Feeling your feet on the ground, your bottom in your chair, or wherever you're sitting, and really feeling yourself held in this moment. Staying connected with your breath. And sensing into the energy of this space, even though we're not together physically, energetically, we are together. And so sensing into the energy of the group that's here, that's come here today to learn a little bit about Anishinaabe culture and values. Remembering to stay connected to your breath. Feeling your body held by the earth. And then we'll take a final closing, just a nice big cleansing breath together, inhaling deeply in through the nose. A nice slow exhale out through the mouth. And then if you had your eyes closed and you come back into the space, you can go ahead and open your eyes. Maybe it is a good thing I did it after all the technology issues. So I like to start everything I do with that grounding, just bringing ourselves back into the present moment, being as fully present as we can with whatever's happening in this moment, whoever we're connected with, whatever we're trying to learn. And I want to be really transparent that although I am Anishinaabe, and I'm here today to share with you about Anishinaabe cultures and values, and we'll talk a little bit of history, I'm by no means an expert. So, both of my dad's parents were fluent Ojibwe speakers, but because of the boarding school experience, they didn't speak Ojibwe Moan around their children. And so my dad didn't learn it. And both of my grandparents passed in their early 60s. I was one when my grandma passed. I was a month old when my grandpa passed. So I never got to hear them speak the language. And so I speak very little today. What little I do know, I learned at St. Cloud State when I was there many, many years ago. So Bungi Etago Ninita Ojibwe Mwem. I speak very little Ojibwe. And I also didn't grow up on the reservation. I grew up actually about 30 miles west of Brainerd, in a small rural town where my family pretty much was the diversity. So that was a little bit challenging. And I also want to sort of mention, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but because of things like historical trauma, boarding schools, and other assimilation policies and practices, it made practicing our ceremonies illegal. And it also removed us from our homelands. Many of us didn't grow up hearing our Indigenous languages, learning the values, participating in ceremonies or cultural activities. So a lot of the work that I do today is, as I mentioned, really trying to help reconnect those pieces for our Indigenous communities. So I am very honored and grateful to be here with you all today, though, and to share what I do know, what I have learned, what I've been taught, and I look forward to the conversation afterwards. So I just want to start sort of by orientating us to the tribes that are in Minnesota. So originally Minnesota was the homeland of the Dakota people. The Dakota are part of what we call the Great Sioux Nation. So that includes the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota. And Ojibwe people migrated actually to Minnesota. We originated on the East Coast. One of our prophecies said that if we didn't move west, that we would be destroyed. And so our people started moving westward. And so we have Anishinaabe people through Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota, parts of North Dakota, eastern North Dakota, and even into Canada. So we sort of migrated this way into Minnesota. And then at one point, and this is a little known fact, in fact, I didn't know it until maybe about 8 years ago, there was a time when the Ho-Chunk, who originated in Wisconsin, were removed from Wisconsin down to Iowa and then up into Minnesota, where they were, you can see on the map here, central Minnesota, sort of where we are. It was sort of the line between where the Dakota lived and the Ojibwe or the Anishinaabe lived. And so they parked the Ho-Chunk right in the middle because the Dakota and the Ojibwe were warring. We were in conflict. So that didn't turn out very well. And then eventually the Ho-Chunk continued on to Nebraska. So that's just sort of a little fact that a lot of people don't know. But today in Minnesota, there are 11 tribal nations that reside here. There are 7 Anishinaabe, and those again are in sort of central and northern Minnesota, and then 4 Dakota communities in the southern part of the state. These are really rough estimates. These numbers are probably a little bit old. I know the census just came out, so there's a lot more Indigenous people than were previously on the census for a whole bunch of reasons, including just not being counted. But so these numbers are actually probably pretty low. But as I mentioned, I'm from the Red Lake Nation, and so this just gives you an estimate of how many approximately there are. There's also a very large urban Native population in Minnesota, and only about half of the enrolled members, and this is enrolled members, only half of the enrolled members actually live on our respective reservations. About half of us reside off the reservation. So I also want to sort of highlight this piece of it, because this is something that oftentimes people don't understand, is that Indigenous peoples, we are not considered like a racial minority group, like other, other groups are. We are actually members of sovereign nations. So I have dual citizenship. I'm enrolled in Red Lake. So I'm a citizen of the Red Lake Nation, and then I'm also a US citizen. So when we think about sort of the uniqueness of tribes, the sovereignty of the tribes meant that treaties were created between tribes and between the federal government. Treaties only happen between nations. So that's something that a lot of times people forget, is that we're not just ethnically or racially different, but we actually politically are different. And within our tribal, nations, we have our own governments and healthcare systems and all sorts of things that our tribal government runs for the people. So before we get into the values, I wanted to share a little bit about leadership, since I just talked about leadership. But this is the traditional Ojibwe clan system, and so Anishinabe do dame. So when I gave my introduction, I said Megazin and do dame. So I'm from the Eagle clan. And our clan systems really were created to help maintain societal order for the Anishinaabe. And this worked for thousands of years. And it helped our people understand like what our role and responsibility within the larger community was. So the Loon and the Crane clans, that's the Hmong and the Ajijak, those are the leaders, the orators, those were the chieftain clans. And then you have the Fish clan, Gigoon. If there were conflict between the two leadership clans, the Fish clan would come in and they would help mediate that conflict. They were also the ones that were responsible for water ceremonies and were connected to the star teachings. The Birds, the Benesi, are the teachers and spiritual leaders and advisors. The Makwa, the bear, are the protectors, the healers for the people. So, they were the ones who were, if you think about the bear, they're out there foraging in the woods, and they know the plants and the medicines and stuff. So the people from the Makwa clan were the ones that would gather the medicines, and they were the healers for the people. The Martin clan, the Wabajeshi, are the warriors, the hunters, the providers. They were the ones that helped keep the people safe. And then Wawashkeshi, they were the Deer clan, the gentle people, the reconciler, the artisans of our communities. So these were sort of the original, these are the 7 original clans. There are other clans that have emerged since then. But one of the things I want to mention is today our governments are not run under the clan system. So unfortunately, because of things like historical trauma, assimilation, the way that we do all sorts of things in our communities have changed, including how we do leadership. I also mentioned I'm from the Red Lake Nation, and one of the things I want to mention is that the Red Lake Nation is unique among every other tribal indigenous nation in this country, with the exception of one. We are one of 2 who were somehow able to avoid allotment. And allotment was an act that was passed by Congress. I won't get into all of it, but its purpose was to assimilate indigenous people by forcing us to own land, and then also to whatever land wasn't allotted to us as indigenous people, the extra was sold to non-native people. So you'll notice today on a lot of the reservations, there are what's called checkerboard reservations, but in Minnesota, or excuse me, in Red Lake, all of our land continues to remain in trust. So the nation retains all of the land. Nobody owns any land up in Red Lake. Okay, so, and I wanted to mention 2 other things. So there are 2 organizations that are statewide that that help to provide governance for sort of the larger in a broader way. So all of the Anishinaabe nations, with the exception of Red Lake, because we're closed, are part of what's called Minnesota Chippewa tribe, and Minnesota Chippewa tribe is a federally recognized tribal government, and they have representatives from each of the 6 Anishinaabe nations that reside or, are on Minnesota Chippewa tribe. And the role of MCT is to protect, develop, and conserve tribal resources and common property, and to promote the general welfare of tribes and their descendants. And then MIAC is Minnesota Indian Affairs Council. They were created in 1963 with the mission to protect the sovereignty of the 11 tribes and to ensure the well-being of American Indian citizens throughout the state of Minnesota. And MIAC has members, again, comprised of all 11 tribal nations across the state. So they advise, they make recommendations to state lawmakers, the governor, et cetera. So I want to just mention, and I want this to be a resource as well. So I was asked to do a talk on the 7 teachings, and I'm going to talk about the 7 teachings, but I'm not an expert in the 7 teachings, and I'm also not fluent in Ojibwe. But James Vukolich, who actually is a Brainerd graduate, is a linguist. He is an international author and speaker, and he does lots of amazing presentations on the 7 teachings where he breaks down the different word parts. One of the things to know about Ojibwe is that it's a descriptive language. It's very verb heavy. It's about, it's movement and action. So, so there's a lot of richness in the language that James is able to share. So the very top link is one where he is doing a presentation for Red Lake Tribal College. And then he also started Word of the Day. And so that's his Facebook page to check out Word of the Day. I highly encourage that. And in lieu of James being here, I'm going to do the best that I can. And in lieu of other elders or cultural teachers who know this information much better than I do, but I will do the best I can to fill in today. So, Thomas X is just powerful message and beautiful video sharing the 7 grandfather teachings, the 7 sacred laws of the Anishinaabe or the Ojibwe. A few important things to note about the 7 teachings before we take a deeper dive is that traditionally, as Indigenous people, we recognize the interconnection of everything. We recognize that we were part of a much larger whole. We weren't above anything. We were part of it. Another piece is that we didn't necessarily see a clear delineation between past, present, and future. This sort of linear timeline is a very Western concept. So, that's not necessarily how Indigenous people see or experience time. We recognize that interconnection between our ancestors, ourselves, and our descendants to come. And so when we think about our descendants to come, you might have heard of things like thinking 7 generations out. And, James talks a lot about that in his talks about how we, as Anishinaabe, we used to really be intentional and try to think through how would the decisions that we made today or the thoughts that we have, how does that, because our thoughts are energy too, how does that impact those that are yet to come, not just our children and grandchildren, but our great-grandchildren and our great-great-grandchildren and all the way 7 generations out. So that too is a really different way of thinking about our world and thinking about our responsibility, not just to those who are our immediate family, but to descendants that we'll never meet. Let's see. The other thing I want to mention before I get into them is that, and James also talks about this, but that I mentioned that that Ojibwe is very verb heavy, and all of these teachings, all of these words that I'm going to share are verbs. They're actions, they're things that you do. It's not just like, oh, these are the values, this is what I believe. It's these are the values and this is how I live my life. So again, it's a different way of embodying beliefs and living our beliefs in a really powerful way. So we'll start with Debesindizawin, which is humility. And humility really speaks to that piece around recognizing that we are not above anyone else or anything else, including our plant and animal relatives, including all of the beings that exist on this planet besides us, the insects, the winged ones, the water, that we are in relationship and connection with all of them. So you might hear terms like we are all related or all my relations. Like that speaks to the recognition that my relatives are not just my blood relatives, but all of the beings on this planet. We are interconnected through spirit, and that makes us related. So remembering that piece that we are all related helps us to have humility in the things that we do in our lives. Menaji Idewin is respect. And one of the things that James talks about this word is he says, Menage means to go easy on. So when we think about respect and going easy on, it's about only taking what we need, recognizing that when we hunt, when we gather, when we fish, that we're taking a life. And so we only take what we need, and recognizing that all of those relatives of ours are giving their lives to be able to sustain our lives. So it's that respect and reciprocity of the process, and not just taking as much as I can and, hoarding or whatever. It's a very different way of being and walking in the world. And when I really started digging into this value in particular, it really made me understand more the clash and conflict between the indigenous peoples here in North America and the people that came over from Europe. Very different worldviews about everything else that's around us. So as I just mentioned, as Ojibwe people, we saw all of the other beings as relatives, whereas sort of the people that came over from Europe saw resources. They saw things to be utilized, to be, to use to be able to make money and those types of things. And so it was just a really different way of being in relationship and working in the world. And those worldviews just continued to clash over and over again, and led to, all sorts of things, including the attempted forced assimilation of Indigenous people, because as long as Indigenous people continued to see the world in that way, and all of our relatives, then that made it hard for, we just couldn't assimilate to the values, the Western values that we were being asked to assimilate to. The next one is Zaga Idewin, which is love. And this is really about an unconditional sort of love, giving freely from our hearts, helping those in need. Again, seeing where there's need and providing it when we can. It's a love that doesn't have strings attached. Zungi Idewin is bravery or courage. It's to be strong of heart, to do the right thing, even when it's really difficult, even when we're feeling afraid. That Zungi Idewin doesn't mean that we don't feel fear. It means that even in the face of our fear, or even when we're facing fear, that we show up with courage and we do the right thing, even when it's hard. Debwewin. Debwewin is truth. And I love the way that, so James frames this. There's two different Indigenous elders who shared two different interpretations of this for him. And one, it says, it can mean, I'm speaking to you from the core of my being, from my heart. So Debwewin. I'm speaking the truth. I'm speaking from my heart. I'm speaking from the core of who I am. And the core of who we are as Indigenous people is spirit, is connected to spirit. And so we're speaking from that spiritual part of ourselves, that part that is true, that is love. That is the part that we're speaking from. It can also mean I'm speaking to the fullest extent that I can. So, I'm not embellishing on anything. I'm not omitting anything. I'm not only telling just enough, but I'm telling it to the full extent that I know and understand it. Because again, when we think about life, we can have the same experiences, but experience it very differently. So Debwewin is really about speaking my truth, how I experience things and how I'm experiencing life. Gwayakwa Diziwin. So this is honesty and virtue. And this isn't about what we say. It's about what we do. It's about how we live our life, that there's an alignment between what we say and what we do, that there's an alignment in that. When our words and actions meet up, where there are not contradictions. And this is, I think, really important. And this is something that is really, there's, a lot of these values are missing across, the world and our country and even to a degree in our own Indigenous communities today. But when our words and our actions align, it's really powerful and people can feel that in a way that resonates with their own spirit. So this is a really powerful way to walk in the world where our words and our actions align. And then the last one is Nibwakawin. Nibwakawin, which means wisdom or intelligence. So when we live these other values, when we live the values of truth and respect and humility and love, when we're living in that, when we're everything that we do and say and how we show up in the world is that, then wisdom and intelligence will come from that. That's a byproduct of these other values. So I want to just talk a little bit now about sort of Anishinaabe lifeways, traditionally living by the seasons. And one of the things that's important to note is, and I'll sort of go through each of these, but the Anishinaabe, we had different camps for different seasons. And so we moved around a lot, and that required a lot of land. So one of the things when, tribes or Anishinaabe were forced onto reservations, the amount of land was too small to really support the number of people and what we needed. And so that became a problem. But so we'll start with spring, since spring just sprung a couple of days ago, right? Thank goodness, although this morning it was pretty chilly. So in the springtime, this was a really exciting time for the Anishinaabe. We all know Minnesota winters are hard, and I don't know if you can imagine living through a Minnesota winter without indoor heating and plumbing and all those things, being able to go to the grocery store. And so food could get really scarce. And by the end of the winter, people were very, very hungry, and some were starving and some had died from starvation. And so spring was a happy time. It was a reminder that, things were going to get easier, and it was time to go maple syruping. And so maple syrup camps are, families would travel there, and we would do maple syruping together, and relatives and friends would come together and gather after a long winter away and reconnect and catch up. And so then summertime, of course, everything in Minnesota, there's so much abundance everywhere, the animals, the plants, all of those things. So the Anishinaabe would come together in much larger camps during the summertime because, the beings around us, our plant and animal relatives, could support larger groups of us together. So we did things like gardening, we had berry camps, medicine picking, collection of materials that we'd need throughout the year for basket making, for clothes, and all those types of things. So it was a really, really busy time, but it was also an exciting time because, again, people were coming together, people were, snagging. For those of you that are native, that's always an exciting time to, start snagging and finding a partner and so summer was an exciting time, and lots of games were played and all sorts of things. So then around August, then we would move to our ricing camps. And so Minomen, and I don't think I had mentioned this, but when the Ojibwe migrated from the East Coast to where we are today, we were told that the prophecy said that we would know we had arrived where we should stay when we came to where the food grew on water. And the food that grows on water is our sacred Minomen, the wild rice. And so this is a really important time of year for our people. And we would go out ricing and collect rice and then harvest rice with, do the whole processing part of it, which has lots of steps, is really intensive, but definitely a really exciting time for the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe. And then, of course, also during the fall, people were incredibly busy hunting and fishing and drying foods and trying to store as much food as they could for the long winter, because we know when winter comes and it gets really cold, a lot, our plant relatives go to sleep, and a lot of our animal relatives, they hibernate as well. So it can be really difficult to hunt and fish in the winter time. So they would do lots of collecting then. And then winter was a time again where, our plant and animal relatives were asleep. And so we would spread back out into very small family groups. So, groups of like 7 to 10, spread out so that we didn't take too much of the resources that were available yet for us, too many of our plant and animal relatives. But it was also a time for storytelling. When there's snow on the ground, that's the time that we can tell our stories about Winnebuju and all of the lessons, the goofy things he did, and the important things that he did. So the lessons that we learned through those stories. Children would go sledding on toboggans or on large pieces of bark. Snowshoe races, snow snakes is and was a big thing. So just lots of different winter games to sort of help the winter pass a little bit easier. So, I all of these pictures that are on here are pictures of people, our Anishinaabe people who are still doing these practices today. So I just wanted to highlight, like, these are not things that we used to do and nobody does them anymore. There are definitely people in our community that still do these things, and more that are reconnecting with these. All right. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but many of the things that made our people strong, whether we're talking about things like our clan system, our family systems, our family systems were not just, nuclear families of mother, father, children, but it really was, aunts and uncles were seen as moms and dads. They, grandparents helped raise kids. Cousins were like siblings. So extended family was really important and would help create that strong foundation to rear healthy children and families. And so our extended families are really important. Our connection to the earth and to our relationship with our plant and animal relatives, living in the rhythm of the seasons, moving through the seasons in a way that is in alignment with what's happening in our environment. Just a quick example of how that's different is in the wintertime, the Anishinaabe, everything slowed down because everything is, almost everything is hibernating and sleeping. And so the Anishinaabe weren't super busy then. We had to conserve energy because, winters got really long. And so there was a time to settle, a time to maybe not work quite as hard, to allow our energy to restore. And that's very different from how we live today, where it's, we're going 100 miles an hour, 12 months out of the year. So anyway, just that, being in sync and rhythm with the seasons, our ceremonies and sacred laws, all of these things came under siege through the attempted genocide and assimilation of Indigenous peoples across this country. So things like warfare, genocide, disease, which wiped out huge portions of Indigenous people. The low estimates are about 30 million pre-contact, up to, like, I've heard even as high as 120 million before contact. And by, I think it was 1900, there are around 250,000 Indigenous people left in the United States. That number today, the last I saw per this last census, was around 5 million. So, but still, to go from, such a large number down to 250,000, important to note, because we definitely don't talk about that in this country. And we don't teach this in our schools. Another thing was the destruction of flora and fauna. So this is, just bison skulls. And when you think about our Indigenous relatives who lived on the plains and relied on the bison for food, for shelter, for clothing, for so many things. And then, this intentional killing, murdering of all of these bison, so that forced many of the Plains tribes to have to go onto the reservations because they no longer had the means to support themselves and their families. Removal from homelands, relocation, forced onto reservations. Reservations, again, not being very overcrowded. The resources, the payments, the annuities, the things that were promised in the treaties, if they came at all, they often came late. Food would come sometimes rotten. So people were literally freezing and starving to death on the reservation, but if they left, they could be shot. So, it's a hard place to be. Boarding schools, removal of children, children as young as the youngest I heard was 2.5 years old. And I'm a mother of 4, and my heart just breaks thinking about what that must have been like for the children, and then the families left behind, the parents, the grandparents, the aunties and uncles and cousins who were so close-knit, who were so tight. And many of these schools, children were sent, hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. The purpose of the schools was assimilation. It was not education, it was assimilation. You have the continual removal of children, Indigenous children, from their homes, placed into foster care, adopted out. That sort of era has, to a degree, ended, and yet in Minnesota, Indigenous children are taken at a significantly higher rate out of home, placed out of home, than any other group. So this removal of children and continues to happen. Excuse me, I mentioned the Allotment Act and then the Indian Relocation Act, which was more in the 60s, and this is just a flyer from it. And it's like, come to Denver, good jobs, happy homes, training. So, conditions on the reservations were really challenging. And so the federal government thought, well, if we can get everyone off the reservation, then we don't have to uphold our ends of the treaty anymore. And then we can sort of wash our hands of this. And so a lot of Indigenous people were took advantage of it. They thought they were trying to do something good. And there were big cities across the, so like Chicago, Denver, Oakland. There were about 5 or 6 big cities across the United States that Indigenous people were sent to. They were basically given one-way tickets. But when they got there, there were no homes waiting for them. There were no jobs. There was no training. So homelessness in big cities of Indigenous people became a major issue and still is an issue today. Again, this is related to the boarding schools. General Richard Pratt, was the first one who opened the first school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And he said this: a great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. So there were federally run schools, and then there were also church run schools. And so this assimilation through humiliation was also a really big thing. So the goal of these residential schools, we instill in them a pronounced distaste for the native life so that they will be humiliated when reminded of their origin. When they graduate from our institutions, the children have lost everything native except their blood. So there was such an intentional attempt to assimilate Indigenous people. And it's created lots of challenges in our communities that continues to ripple out today. So these are just some things that come from elder interviews, loss of language, a sense of guilt for language not being passed on. Because Indigenous, if you spoke your language in the boarding schools, you could be severely punished. I've heard just heartbreaking tales of Indigenous elders who were probably like my grandparents, who were too afraid to speak the language to teach their kids because of their own association with speaking it meant pain, meant harm, and they didn't want that harm to come to their children. Again, language loss tied to boarding school, a sense of hopelessness, erosion of the traditional family and community, a loss of safety, a sense of security and caring for one another. So trauma really is a separation. And when we think about all of these sort of traumas that were piled on in Indigenous communities, it was all an attempt to separate from family, separate from culture, separate from, land and plant and animal relatives. Loss of land, broken treaties, and a strong sense of loss and despair regarding violence, drugs, and alcohol use. I want to mention this really quickly because this is an important piece. I remember when I first started doing presentations on historical trauma and adverse childhood experiences and how that connects for tribal communities, like some people would actually say, well, that was a long time ago. Why don't you all just get over it? right? Well, so as Anishinaabe people, we have a concept that in English is called blood memory. And what that concept is that the experiences that our ancestors have can get passed down to future generations. And Western science is finally starting to catch up with this wisdom. And Western science knows this as epigenetics. So epi means to sit on top of. And so epigenetics is about what sits on top of our genetic code. So what are those things that influence our genetics, our DNA? And it's the experiences that we have. Sort of one of the ways that they learned about this was through studies with mice and rats. And they would take male mice and they would put them in cages, and in the bottom of the cages, they had shock pads. And every time they would infuse the scented cherry blossom, they would shock the feet of the mice. Well, we know through psychology and Pavlov's dogs that, an association was made between the smell and the pain. And so after doing this, where the association was made, they took that first generation, they bred them to females. The females had pups. The pups grew up. They didn't do anything to the pups. But once they were fully grown, they infused the scented cherry blossoms. And those little mice went scurrying to the corner of their cages, shaking, terrified. They took the second generation. They bred them to females. Females had pups. They let the pups grow up, didn't do anything to them. When they were fully grown, scented cherry blossoms, same terrified response. And they had more smell receptors in their nose for cherry blossoms. And there were some structural changes in the brain as well. So you can see that these changes from like the first generation, those experiences lasted at least 2 more generations out, impacting those offspring. This is Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. She's the person who sort of coined the term historical trauma in her research. And she says the historical trauma response is the constellation of features in reaction to this trauma. The historical trauma response often includes things like depression, self-destructive behavior, suicidal thoughts and gestures, anxiety, low self-esteem, anger, and difficulty recognizing and expressing emotions. It may include substance abuse, often in an attempt to avoid painful feelings through self-medication. So a lot of the challenges, I would say all of the challenges that we see in our Indigenous communities today is directly tied to unresolved historical trauma and ongoing trauma in our communities. So, I mentioned that trauma creates disconnection from ourselves, from our mind, body, spirit, disconnection from one another, disconnection from our environment around us, our plant and animal relatives. And so given so many of those practices and those ways of being that help keep our families and communities strong and thriving were intentionally dismantled, the work of us as Indigenous people today is to remember, bring back together, remember, reclaim, and reconnect to those life ways, to those values, to those ways of being in relationship with ourselves and with those around us, not just those that we see here today, but including those that are yet to come. So I don't even have any idea what time it is. It probably went way too long, but I'm gonna stop sharing now.
Susan McGwitch, thank you so very much for sharing. That was absolutely fantastic. We have a handful of questions here that I'd like to share with you if possible. And for those of you that have joined us today, if you have questions, please consider putting them as well into the Q&A specifically, and we will use the remaining couple minutes that we have here to share some of those questions. So the first question that I'd like to share with you, Susan, is from a student, and Carla asks, Red Lake, you said, people don't own the land, but the tribe does. Do people own their own homes or just the lots? I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about home ownership. Carla's interested how that works in Red Lake.
Yeah, so it's interesting, and it can also be a little bit challenging with the way that home loans are given out. It's hard to get a home loan when you don't own the land that you want to put the home on. So that has been a challenge, but a lot of the homes in Red Lake are built by the Red Lake Nation for our people. They're maintained by the Red Lake Nation. So a lot of the homes are not necessarily privately owned. There are some privately owned homes up there, but again, it takes a little bit of maneuvering because all of the land is held in trust. So I'm definitely not an expert in that. I've not tried to build a home up there yet, but I know when I was looking into it, I started seeing some of the challenges with that, and yet I don't think any of us Red Lakers would do it any differently. So we are incredibly grateful that our ancestors had the foresight to maintain the land in common and not succumb to allotment.
Caitlin asks, in your opinion, Susan, do you think the 7 teachings relate to all cultures? Do they relate more to certain cultures as opposed to others?
I think that's a really great question. When I think about some of our, so the 7 teachings that I spoke about were specifically for the Anishinaabe. The Dakota have their own, but they're very similar. There's a lot of overlap there. And in a lot of the indigenous cultures that I've sort of looked at values and things like that, there's a lot of overlap. I think even across indigenous cultures around the world, you see that sort of like that reciprocity of relationship, that understanding of the interconnection of everything, the understanding of our place within that, not above, but like part of. And one of the things that I want to remind folks is that we all are indigenous to somewhere. We all at one point had very, very, very close ties to land, to plants, to animals, to wherever that home was for us. So we all were indigenous at some point. So I believe that as humans, we all sort of carried a lot of those values at one point because we understood how the world worked and how we fit in it. I believe, and not just because I'm Anishinaabe, but I believe that these values if these were values that people around the world lived, we would be in a very, very different world than we live in today. One that wouldn't have the conflicts that we have, wouldn't be on the brink of, extinction and with climate change and all of these things. So many of our plant and animal relatives already extinct from the things that we as humans have done to this planet. So I think we all could benefit from that. And I believe that there are lots of cultures that have these values similar that are not necessarily indigenous. But one of the things that I've really noticed is, when what you say and what you do doesn't line up, which is what I think we see a lot of people people saying values, but not espousing them, not living them, So it's one thing to say you have a value, but it's a whole nother thing to actually live it. It's a great question.
Well, we might have time for just one more last question from the community. Mr. Lowell Johnson asks, in David Troyer's Res Life, he quotes Henry Schoolcraft's observation that Ojibwe parenting was permissive. And he's asking you to comment on that.
Yeah, I've heard this before too, and not just Ojibwe parenting, but sort of indigenous parenting in general. So traditional indigenous parenting, there was no physical punishment. Children were taught, so observation was used a lot. For example, when a baby was born, we used dickenoggins or cradle boards that would go on, the back of the mother, or they would, set it by a tree if they were working, whatever. So for the first year of their life, babies were in these dickenoggins and they were observing everything around them and what people were doing. And so observation was an important teaching tool, that we pay attention to what's going on before we get involved in it. So that, that's one of the reasons why we did that. And then teaching was done in a very gentle way. Children were watched to see what skills did they have, what talents, what contributions came naturally to them that then people within the community who had similar, skills, talents, contributions could really mentor and support those young people in that. So there was a lot of mentoring that happened through the process. It was done, again, through the values of love and humility. Children were not seen as less than. The word for baby is like sacred being, right? And so just the Abanuji, the words for Ojibwe reminded us of our relationship or of what things were, that these are little spirit beings that are meant to be respected and loved. And so, yeah, it was just a very, very different way of seeing and being in relationship with our children and our extended children, right? Our nieces and nephews. And so incredibly different, which then when, you know, people came over here and there was corporal punishment and things like that, which is also why the boarding schools were incredibly harsh. There was a lot of corporal punishment that happened there, all sorts of abuses and atrocities to the children that they had never experienced in their own Indigenous communities. So, yeah.
Well, Susan, we have dozens of questions here, so I want to thank you so much for generating such a fantastic conversation. We all really appreciate your time today, and thank you once again for presenting. We really
Absolutely. Miigwech for having me today.
And thank you all for joining us, and join us again next April for the next Cultural Thursday here at Central Lakes College. Everyone take care and be well.